Sometimes the people we fear the most turn out to be the ones who understand us best. In a world that judges by appearances, the gentlest souls often hide behind the roughest faces. In the frontier town of Cedar Bluff, Jonas Flint was that man, a mountain giant everyone avoided, with scars and silence that kept folks at a distance. When young Sarah Clemens came to him one morning, her little dog crying without end, the town expected him to turn her away. Instead, Jonas knelt down in that dusty street and did something no one saw coming. What he knew about that dog would change everything. What secret was this feared man hiding all along? Before we continue, tell us where you're watching from, and if this story moves you, subscribe. Tomorrow brings something truly special. The year was 1877, and Cedar Bluff clung to the Montana mountainside like a stubborn prayer. It was the kind of town that tested a person's mettle with every season, winters that could freeze a man's breath before it left his lungs, summers that baked the main street hard as iron. The folks who stayed were either too determined to leave or too rooted to imagine life anywhere else. They built their lives from timber and stone, raised families in the shadow of peaks that touched the clouds, and learned to read the weather in the way the pines bent before a storm. Jonas Flint lived beyond the edge of that community, up where the trail narrowed to nothing more than a deer path, and the air grew thin enough to make a stranger's head swim. His cabin sat in a clearing he'd carved from the wilderness 5 years back, built with his own hands from logs he'd felled and stones he'd hauled from the creek bed. It was a solid structure, tight against the wind, with a stone chimney that sent thin ribbons of smoke into the mountain sky on cold mornings. He came to town maybe once a month, sometimes less if the snows were heavy. When he did appear on Cedar Bluff's main street, conversations stopped mid-sentence. Women gathered their children closer. Men found sudden interest in their boots or the goods displayed in shop windows. Jonas never seemed to notice, or if he did, he gave no sign. He'd tie his horse outside the general store, conduct his business with few words, and disappear back up the mountain before the sun reached its peak. The stories about him had grown in the telling, the way stories do when fact gives way to imagination. Some said he'd killed a man in a duel back east and fled to avoid the hangman's noose. Others whispered he'd survived a grisly attack that left him scarred and half-mad. Mrs. Henley, who ran the boarding house and knew everyone's business, or thought she did, claimed he'd been a soldier who'd seen such horrors in the Indian Wars that he couldn't bear the company of civilized folk anymore. The truth was simpler and sadder than any of their tales, but Jonas had never offered it, and no one had ever asked. He stood well over 6 feet, with shoulders broad enough to fill a doorway and hands that looked like they could snap timber. His face was weathered dark by sun and wind, creased with lines that spoke of hard years and harder choices. A scar ran from his left temple to his jaw, pale against his tanned skin. His eyes were grey as winter clouds, and they held a distance in them that made people look away. But those who paid attention, really paid attention, might have noticed small things that contradicted his fearsome reputation. The way he stepped carefully around a child's toy left in the street, how he'd pause to right an overturned bucket or close a gate left swinging. More than once, widows had found fresh venison hanging from their porches after one of his rare visits to town, though he never claimed credit. When old Samuel Porter's wagon wheel broke on the mountain road, Jonas had appeared like a ghost from the trees, fixed the wheel without a word, and vanished before Samuel could offer thanks or payment. Sarah Clemens knew these stories like everyone else, and they frightened her as they did most folks. She was 19 that autumn, a slip of a girl with auburn hair she kept pinned up proper and hands made nimble by years of needlework. She'd come to Cedar Bluff with her parents when she was 12, and when fever took them both in the space of a week 2 years later, she'd stayed on with her Aunt Martha, the only family she had left in the world. Sarah made her living as a seamstress, and she was good at it. Her stitches were small and even, her patterns precise. She could look at a bolt of fabric and see the dress or shirt or curtain it wanted to become. The wives and daughters of Cedar Bluff sought her out for their fine sewing wedding dresses, Sunday clothes, the kind of garments that required a patient hand and an eye for detail. She worked from a small room behind her aunt's house, with light from a south-facing window and an old Singer sewing machine that had belonged to her mother. It was quiet work, solitary work, and Sarah had made her peace with that. She attended church on Sundays, helped at community gatherings when they asked her, and kept to herself otherwise. The young men of Cedar Bluff had courted her once or twice, but nothing had taken root. She was too quiet for some, too particular for others, or perhaps, though she wouldn't admit it even to herself, too lonely in a way that company couldn't quite reach. Her one constant companion was Copper, a small terrier with wire-rough fur the color of autumn leaves. Her father had brought him home as a puppy the month before he died, a tiny thing that fit in Sarah's cupped hands. That dog had been her comfort through grief, her company through long evenings, the living thing that depended on her and gave her purpose beyond needle and thread. Copper slept at the foot of her bed, followed her from room to room, waited patient as stone while she worked at her sewing machine. The town had other characters who filled out its daily rhythms. Sheriff Ben Dalton kept the peace with a gruff demeanor and a surprisingly gentle heart. He'd been a lawman for 20 years, and he knew when to enforce the letter of the law and when to look the other way. Doc Samuel Pierce ran the only medical practice within 50 miles, working from a small office attached to his home. He was a competent physician, trained back east before heading west for adventure in his youth, now in his 60s, and feeling every year of it. Then there was Mrs. Henley, whose boarding house sat at the corner of Main and Church Streets. She was a widow of indeterminate age who considered it her civic duty to know everything happening in Cedar Bluff and to share that knowledge liberally. If you wanted news spread, you told Mrs. Henley. If you wanted secrets kept, you avoided her altogether. Life in Cedar Bluff moved with the seasons and the demands of survival. Spring brought planting and the return of game to the high country. Summer meant long days of work, storing up against winter's inevitable arrival. Autumn was harvest and preparation, a scramble to ensure every family had enough to last. And winter demanded respect. It isolated the town for weeks at a time, tested every structure and every soul, and reminded everyone that nature still held dominion here. Into this established rhythm came the disruption that would change everything, though no one recognized it at first. 3 days before Sarah approached Jonas in the street, Copper began to cry. Not the normal bark or whine of a dog wanting attention or needing to go outside, but a sustained, anguished sound that came from somewhere deep and hurt. Sarah tried everything she could think of. She examined him for injuries, checked his paws for thorns or cuts, offered his favorite foods. Nothing helped. The crying continued, hour after hour, through the day and into the night. By the second day, Aunt Martha was beside herself. The sound was driving her to distraction, she said. Couldn't Sarah do something? Make it stop? Take the dog outside? Sarah, exhausted from lack of sleep and sick with worry, carried Copper to Doc Pierce's office. The doctor examined the small terrier with professional thoroughness, but found nothing wrong. No fever, no obvious injury, no sign of illness. Some dogs just got notions in their heads, he told her kindly. Probably pass in a day or two. But it didn't pass. The third night was the worst yet. Copper's cries echoed through the small house, high and desperate. Sarah held him, walked with him, tried everything she could imagine to bring comfort. Nothing touched whatever pain he was in. By dawn of the 4th day, Sarah sat at her kitchen table with tears streaming down her face, the dog trembling in her lap, still crying that terrible, unending cry. That's when she overheard the conversation that changed everything. She'd gone to the general store for supplies, leaving Copper with Aunt Martha, and found Mrs. Henley holding forth to a small audience near the fabric counter. The subject was Jonas Flint, as it often was when Mrs. Henley got going. The boarding house keeper was recounting an incident from years back, before Jonas had retreated so completely to his mountain. A rancher's prize horse had fallen sick, she said, and nothing the man tried would save it. Someone she couldn't recall who had mentioned that the mountain man had a way with animals. The rancher, desperate, had sought Jonas out. Whatever Jonas did, that horse recovered. Mrs. Henley couldn't say more than that, but she remembered it clear as day. Sarah stood frozen by the bolts of calico, her heart suddenly pounding. A way with animals. Could it be true? Or was it just another tall tale woven around the mysterious man in the mountains? She thought of Copper's cries, the desperate, unceasing pain he was in. She thought of Doc Pierce's helpless shrug. She thought of the whispered suggestions from some of the town women that perhaps it would be a mercy to put the poor creature down. No, she wouldn't accept that. Not without trying everything, even something as frightening as approaching Jonas Flint. The decision made, Sarah felt fear and hope warring in her chest in equal measure. She finished her shopping in a daze, barely hearing the goodbyes offered as she left. That evening, she told Aunt Martha what she planned to do. Her aunt was horrified, warned her against such foolishness, said no good could come from seeking out that man. But Sarah had made up her mind, and Martha knew her niece well enough to recognize that stubborn set to her jaw. The next morning, as the sun was just beginning to paint the eastern sky pink, Sarah prepared herself. She dressed in her most practical clothes, pinned her hair securely, and lifted Copper, still crying, still trembling, into her arms. The little dog's cries had grown weaker now, and that frightened her more than anything. She wrapped him in a soft blanket and held him close. The walk to town took 15 minutes. By the time Sarah reached the main street, several early risers were already about their business. She saw Jonas's tall figure outside the general store, loading supplies into saddlebags on his massive bay horse. Her courage nearly failed her then. He looked so large, so forbidding in the pale morning light. But Copper whimpered against her chest, and that sound pushed her forward. One foot in front of the other, Sarah crossed the dusty street. She was aware of people stopping, staring, the sudden hush that fell over the morning. She kept her eyes on Jonas, watching as he noticed her approach and straightened, waiting. When she stood before him, Sarah had to tilt her head back to meet his eyes. They were grey and distant as she'd expected, but not unkind, not cruel, just watchful. Her voice shook, but the words came out clear enough. "Sir, my dog won't stop crying. Please, can you help?" Jonas Flint looked down at the young woman standing before him, her face pale with fear and determination in equal measure. In her arms, wrapped in a faded quilt, a small terrier trembled and whined a sound so pitiful it could break a heart that hadn't already been thoroughly broken. The entire street had gone silent. He could feel eyes on them from every doorway and window, could sense the collective held breath of Cedar Bluff, waiting to see what the mountain man would do. His first instinct was to refuse. He'd walked away from healing 5 years ago, left it buried with Elizabeth and Emma in that frozen Dakota ground. He'd sworn he'd never again put himself in the position of holding a life in his hands. Feeling it slip away, despite everything he knew, everything he'd learned. The weight of that failure had driven him to these mountains, and he'd made his peace with solitude. But something in Sarah Clemens's eyes stopped the refusal before it reached his lips. It wasn't just fear he saw there, though there was plenty of that. It was the same desperate hope he'd seen in mirrors after Elizabeth and Emma took sick, the wild belief that if you just tried hard enough, cared enough, refused to give up, you could bend fate to your will. He'd learned how wrong that belief could be, but he recognized the fierce love that fueled it. When did the crying start? His voice came out rougher than he intended, unused to conversation after days alone in his cabin. Sarah blinked, clearly surprised he'd spoken at all. 3 days ago, sir. In the morning. He just started crying and hasn't stopped since. Doc Pierce look at him? Yes, sir. Said he couldn't find anything wrong. Her voice wavered slightly. Some of the women said maybe it would be a mercy to. She couldn't finish the sentence, just held the small dog closer. Jonas studied the terrier more carefully. Even from where he stood, he could see the animal was in genuine distress. This wasn't behavioral. Something was hurting that dog, and whatever it was getting worse. The whines had a quality he recognized from his years treating soldiers, the sound of pain that had gone on too long, the kind that wore down both body and spirit. He could walk away, should walk away. Let Doc Pierce handle it, or let nature take its course. It would be easier, safer, for everyone involved. Safer for him especially, to keep the walls he'd built between himself and the world intact. But he'd never been good at taking the easy path, and 5 years of isolation hadn't changed that fundamental part of who he was. "Bring him to my cabin," Jonas said quietly. "Dawn tomorrow. You know where the trail starts?" "Yes, sir. It's a hard climb. Take your time." He paused, then added, "The dog will be all right until then. Whatever's wrong has been wrong 3 days already. One more night won't make it worse." He didn't know if that was true, but he could see she needed to hear it. Sarah's eyes filled with tears, relief, gratitude. He couldn't tell which. She nodded, unable to speak. Jonas turned back to his horse, finished securing his supplies. Behind him, he heard Sarah's retreating footsteps, and then the explosion of whispered conversation that erupted the moment she was out of earshot. He didn't need to hear the words to know what they were saying. Questions, speculation, warnings. The mountain man and the seamstress. What could come of that but trouble? He swung into the saddle and urged his horse toward the mountain trail, but not before catching Sheriff Dalton's eye. The lawman stood in the doorway of his office, arms crossed, expression unreadable. Jonas gave him a small nod. Dalton returned it after a moment's hesitation. Whatever the sheriff thought about the situation, at least he wasn't going to interfere. The ride up the mountain gave Jonas too much time to think. What had he just agreed to? He hadn't practiced medicine in 5 years. His hands were calloused from chopping wood and building stone walls, not from surgery and delicate procedures. What if his skills had dulled? What if he looked at that dog and couldn't figure out what was wrong? Worse, what if he knew what was wrong but couldn't fix it? The cabin came into view as the sun reached its peak, solid and familiar. He'd built it well, tight walls, good roof, a chimney that drew properly even in the worst winds. Inside, everything had its place. The main room held a stone fireplace, a sturdy table and chairs he'd made himself, shelves lined with books he'd carried up from town over the years. A narrow loft held his bed, but in the corner, covered with an old canvas tarp, sat the medical bag he hadn't opened in 5 years. Jonas unsaddled his horse, saw to the animal's needs, then stood in his cabin staring at that covered corner. Slowly, he walked over and pulled the tarp away. Dust rose in the afternoon light slanting through the window. The leather bag was exactly as he'd left it, worn but well made, stuffed full of instruments and supplies. His initials were stamped into the leather, J.E.F., Jonas Elijah Flint, Army Surgeon. He set the bag on the table and opened it. The familiar smell hit him immediately, leather, metal, the faint medicinal scent of herbs and tinctures. His instruments lay nested in their compartments, still clean, still sharp. Scalpels, forceps, needles, clamps. Each one brought back memories he'd tried so hard to bury. Elizabeth's voice echoed in his head. "You have a gift, Jonas. God gave you healing hands." She'd been so proud when he completed his medical training, so excited when the army appointed him as a surgeon. They'd married young, full of dreams about the life they'd build together. Emma had come 2 years later, perfect and whole, with her mother's dark hair and her father's grey eyes. Jonas closed his eyes against the memories, but they came anyway. The posting to Fort Madison in Dakota Territory. Elizabeth and Emma making their quarters into a home, cheerful despite the harsh conditions. Emma learning to walk, then run, her laughter filling their small space. 3 years of happiness, of purpose, of believing he was exactly where he was meant to be. Then the cholera. It had swept through the fort in the dead of winter, brought in by a supply wagon from the east. One day people were healthy, the next they were dying. Jonas had worked himself nearly to death trying to save them, but cholera was merciless. No matter what he did, no matter how much he knew, people kept dying. When Elizabeth fell ill, he'd refused to believe it. Not her. He wouldn't allow it. He'd pulled every bit of knowledge he had, tried every treatment, but she'd slipped away in 3 days, her body racked by the disease, beyond anything his medicine could touch. Emma had gotten sick the same day her mother died. Jonas had held his daughter through her suffering, watched the light fade from those grey eyes that matched his own, and felt his soul break into pieces no surgery could ever repair. He'd buried them side by side in the frozen ground, walked away from the fort, and kept walking until the mountains swallowed him whole. The army sent letters for a while, asking him to return, telling him he was needed. He never answered. What good was being needed when you couldn't save the 2 people who mattered most? Jonas opened his eyes and looked at the medical bag, really looked at it. Tomorrow Sarah Clemens would climb this mountain with her dying dog, putting her trust in a man the whole town feared, asking him to do the one thing he'd sworn never to do again. He could still refuse. Could send her away. She'd be disappointed, maybe hurt, but she'd survive. The dog probably wouldn't, but he'd made his peace with death a long time ago. Except he hadn't, had he? That was the lie he'd been telling himself for 5 years. If he'd truly made peace with death, he wouldn't be hiding in these mountains. He'd be down in Cedar Bluff, using his skills to help people, doing what he'd trained half his life to do. Instead, he'd run. From the memories, from the guilt, from the terrible knowledge that sometimes all the skill in the world wasn't enough. But Sarah Clemens didn't know any of that. She just knew her dog was suffering, and she'd heard that Jonas Flint might be able to help. She was willing to climb a mountain and face her fears on that slim hope. The least he could do was try. Jonas spent the rest of the afternoon going through his medical bag, checking supplies, making mental notes of what he might need. He had herbs he'd gathered and dried over the years, not for people, he'd told himself, but old habits died hard. He had clean water, alcohol for sterilization, bandages. He had his hands and his knowledge, rust-covered perhaps, but still there. As sunset painted the mountains gold and red, Jonas carried his daughter's toy horse down from the mantle where it had sat untouched for 5 years. It was carved from pine, smooth from Emma's constant handling. She'd loved horses, had made him promise that when they left the fort someday, they'd have a ranch where she could have her own pony. That was never going to happen now. The horse sat in his palm, small and precious and full of ghosts. "I don't know if I can do this," he said aloud to the empty cabin, to the memory of his wife and daughter. "I don't know if I have anything left to give." But even as he said it, he knew he would try. Because that's what Elizabeth would have wanted. She'd never understood his retreat to these mountains, though she would have forgiven it. She'd always believed the best of him, even when he couldn't believe it of himself. And Emma would have loved that little terrier. She'd always been gentle with small creatures, had cried when a bird died after flying into their window. Jonas returned the toy horse to its place and stood looking out at the darkening mountains. Somewhere down there, Sarah Clemens was probably lying awake, holding her dog, hoping that tomorrow would bring answers. He couldn't promise her that. Couldn't promise her anything except that he would look, he would try, he would use whatever skill he still possessed. It would have to be enough. It was all he had left to offer. That night, Jonas barely slept. When dawn finally broke over the peaks, painting the sky in shades of rose and gold, he was already up, coffee made, medical bag open on the table. He'd laid out the instruments he thought he might need, organized his herbs and tinctures, prepared as much as 5 years of rust and isolation would allow. Now all he could do was wait for Sarah Clemens to appear on the trail, bringing her dog and her hope and her desperate faith that the mountain man might have one more miracle left in him. Jonas looked at his hands, large, scarred, weathered by years of hard living. Healing hands, Elizabeth had called them. He'd have to trust that somewhere beneath the calluses and the sorrow, some of that healing still remained. The sun was past its peak when Sarah finally began the descent back to Cedar Bluff. Copper rode secure in her arms, sleeping mostly, occasionally opening his eyes to look up at her with what seemed like contentment. The bandaged paw didn't seem to trouble him. Whatever herbs Jonas had used in that poultice were doing their work. For the first time in days, Sarah felt the tight knot of worry in her chest begin to loosen. Jonas had walked her to the edge of the clearing, carrying a small bundle. Extra bandages, he'd explained, pressing it into her free hand. In case the first one gets soiled, and instructions for the poultice if you need to make more, though I don't think you will. Thank you. Sarah had looked up at him, this man who'd been transformed in her eyes from fearsome stranger to skilled healer. For everything. I don't know what I would have done if you would have found another way. Jonas's expression had been serious. That's what people who love their animals do. They find a way. Now, making her way carefully down the mountain trail, Sarah replayed the afternoon in her mind. After they'd eaten simple food, bread and cheese and dried venison, but good Jonas had surprised her by asking about her sewing. Not polite small talk, but genuine interest. What kinds of things did she make? How had she learned? Did she enjoy the work? Sarah had found herself talking more freely than she had in years. About her mother teaching her to sew, about the satisfaction of creating something beautiful from raw materials, about the quiet meditation of repetitive stitches. Jonas had listened with the same focused attention he'd given to examining copper, and somehow that attention had loosened something inside her. Then, almost without meaning to, she'd asked him to tell her about his family. The silence that followed had been so long she'd thought he wouldn't answer. But then, slowly, haltingly, he'd begun to speak. About Elizabeth, who'd had a laugh like bells and a heart bigger than the frontier. About Emma, who'd been 3 years old and fearless, who loved horses and stories and collecting pretty rocks. About the cholera that had taken them both in the same winter week, despite everything Jonas knew, everything he'd tried. I was a surgeon, he'd said, staring into the fire, trained in Philadelphia, served with the army. I could set bones, remove bullets, stitch wounds that should have been fatal. But I couldn't save my own wife and daughter from a disease that killed them in days. Sarah had seen the way his hands clenched, the tightness in his jaw. 5 years hadn't dulled that pain, just taught him to carry it. So you came here, she'd said softly. So I came here. Figured if I couldn't heal the people I loved most, what right did I have healing anybody? He'd looked at her then, really looked at her. Until this morning I'd kept that promise. 5 years without touching a medical instrument. But you helped copper. Couldn't walk away from suffering when it was right in front of me. Elizabeth would have been disappointed if I had. A ghost of a smile had touched his lips. She always said I had a gift I was meant to use. Guess maybe she was right. The conversation had shifted after that to lighter things, but something had changed between them. A barrier had come down, a connection made. When Sarah had finally prepared to leave, Jonas had seemed almost reluctant to see her go. If you need anything, he'd said. For the dog, I mean. Or if the wound looks worse instead of better. You know where to find me. I do. Sarah had hesitated, then added, I make the trip to town for supplies every few weeks. If you wanted, I could bring you something. Books, maybe? Or, I'd like that. The words had come quickly, as if he'd surprised himself. I mean, if it's not too much trouble. No trouble at all. Now, reaching the bottom of the trail, as the sun touched the western peaks, Sarah felt something she hadn't felt in a long time, anticipation. Not just relief that Copper was healing, though that was part of it, but genuine eagerness to see Jonas again, to continue the conversation they'd started, to learn more about the complicated, wounded, gentle man hiding in the mountains. Cedar Bluff came into view, and with it came the reminder that she'd have to face questions. Lots of questions. Mrs. Henley would be beside herself with curiosity, and half the town would want to know what happened on that mountain. Sarah straightened her shoulders and kept walking. Let them ask. She'd tell them the simple truth. Jonas Flint had saved Copper's life with skill and kindness, and anyone who said otherwise was a fool. True to expectation, she'd barely reached the main street when Mrs. Henley materialized from the boarding house, her face alight with curiosity, barely disguised as concern. "Sarah, dear child, you're back. We were worried sick. And the little dog, is he?" "He's fine." Sarah kept walking, forcing Mrs. Henley to match her pace. Mr. Flint found a thorn embedded in his paw and removed it. Copper's already feeling better. "A thorn! Well, I'll be." "And Mr. Flint, he was, that is. He didn't." Mrs. Henley struggled to phrase her nosiness delicately. "He was professional, kind and skilled. Everything a good doctor should be." Sarah's tone was firm. "Now, if you'll excuse me, Mrs. Henley, I need to get Copper home and settled." She left the boarding house keeper standing in the street, mouth slightly open, and continued toward Aunt Martha's house. But word travelled fast in a small town, and by the time she arrived, several neighbours had gathered, all wanting to see the dog and hear the story. Sarah told it simply, leaving out the personal conversations, focusing on Jonas's medical expertise. She watched faces change as she spoke, skepticism giving way to surprise, then grudging respect. A few still looked doubtful, but most seemed to accept that perhaps there was more to Jonas Flint than rumours and fear. That evening, after Aunt Martha had fussed over both Sarah and Copper and finally retired to bed, Sarah sat at her sewing table with a piece of fine linen and her best thread. She worked by lamplight, her stitches small and precise, creating a pattern of mountain wildflowers, Indian paintbrush and lupine, columbine and mountain aster. She'd seen them growing near Jonas's cabin, had admired their simple beauty. When she finished, 3 days later, she had a handkerchief embroidered with a border of those flowers, delicate and detailed. Not fancy, exactly, but thoughtful, personal. She folded it carefully and set it aside, waiting for the right moment to make another trip up the mountain. That moment came sooner than expected. 2 weeks after Copper's healing, Sarah was working in her sewing room when she heard raised voices from the street. She set aside the dress she was hemming and moved to the window. A small crowd had gathered near the blacksmith's shop, and in the centre she could see Frank Blake, the smithy, holding his young son Timothy. Even from a distance, she could see the boy was in distress, his arm wrapped in a blood-soaked cloth. Sarah grabbed her shawl and hurried outside. As she approached, she heard Frank's desperate voice. "Piece of hot metal caught him. Doc Pierce is 3 towns over, won't be back until tomorrow at earliest. Wounds deep, keeps bleeding no matter what I do." Sheriff Dalton stood nearby, looking grim. "We need to cauterize it or stitch it proper. Anyone here know how?" Silence greeted his question. These were frontier folk, used to handling minor injuries, but this was beyond their skill. Sarah watched Timothy's pale, frightened face and made a decision that surprised even her. Jonas Flint would know how. The crowd turned to stare at her. Frank Blake's expression was desperate but skeptical. The mountain man? He was a surgeon, a trained physician. Sarah's voice carried across the suddenly quiet street. "He saved my dog's life 2 weeks ago, and I watched him work. His hands were steady, his knowledge vast. If anyone can help Timothy, it's him." Frank looked at his son's arm, at the blood still seeping through the bandage, and his face crumpled. "I can't lose him. His mother died bringing him into this world. He's all I got." Then we go to Jonas. Now, Sarah was already moving toward the livery. "Frank, can you ride holding Timothy? I'll take you up the mountain." "I'll go too," Sheriff Dalton said. "Man deserves to know he has the law's support if he's willing to help." Within minutes they were mounted, Frank on his steady draft horse, with Timothy cradled carefully against his chest, Sarah on a borrowed mare, and Sheriff Dalton on his bay gelding. The climb up the mountain trail was harder on horseback, but faster than walking. As they rode, Sarah prayed that Jonas would be home, that he'd be willing to help, that the fragile trust they'd built would extend beyond a small dog to a young boy's life. The cabin appeared as the sun reached its afternoon angle, smoke rising peaceful from the chimney. Jonas emerged before they'd crossed half the clearing, his posture alert, wary. When he saw Sarah, some of the tension left his shoulders, but his eyes went immediately to the blood-soaked bandage on Timothy's arm. Sarah dismounted quickly. "Jonas, this is Frank Blake and his son Timothy. Workshop accident. The wound's deep and won't stop bleeding. Doc Pierce is out of town." She paused, met his eyes directly. "We need your help." Jonas looked at the boy's pale face, at Frank's desperate expression, at Sheriff Dalton's steady gaze. Sarah saw the war playing out behind his eyes, the desire to retreat, warring with the instinct to heal, fear, fighting, compassion. For a long moment, she thought he might refuse. Then Jonas stepped forward, his voice calm and professional. "Bring him inside, quickly now. We need to stop that bleeding and clean the wound properly." As Frank carried Timothy into the cabin, Sarah saw Jonas's hands tremble slightly before he clenched them into fists, then deliberately relaxed them. He was afraid, she realized, afraid of failing again, but he was going to try anyway. That, Sarah thought, was the truest kind of courage there was. Jonas's cabin transformed in moments from peaceful retreat to makeshift surgery. He cleared the table with swift efficiency, laid out clean cloths, began pulling instruments from his medical bag with hands that had steadied the moment he committed to the work. Sarah recognized the change in him. This was the surgeon taking over, pushing past fear and doubt into the clarity of purpose. "Set him here," Jonas instructed, his voice firm and calm. "Sarah, I need you to help. Sheriff, you'll hold the lamp close. Frank, you stay at your boy's head. Keep him calm." Frank lowered Timothy onto the table, the boy whimpering with pain. He looked so small, maybe 7 years old, with his father's dark hair and frightened eyes that kept darting to the blood-soaked bandage on his forearm. "What's your name, son?" Jonas asked, beginning to cut away the makeshift bandaging. "Timothy, sir." The boy's voice shook. "Well, Timothy, I'm Jonas. I'm going to fix your arm, but I need you to be brave for me. Can you do that?" The boy nodded, biting his lip. Jonas worked the last of the bandage free, and Sarah had to steady herself against the sight. The wound was deep, a gash that ran from Timothy's elbow nearly to his wrist, still bleeding sluggishly. She could see muscle tissue, maybe even bone. Jonas examined it with practiced calm, his fingers gentle despite their size. "The metal was hot when it cut him?" "Red hot," Frank confirmed, his face ashen. "Piece broke off from what I was working and flew right at him. Happened so fast." "That's good, actually." The heat cauterized some of the smaller vessels, kept him from bleeding out. Jonas was already preparing his workspace, carbolic acid for cleaning, catgut thread for stitching, instruments laid out in precise order. "The wound's clean. No debris I can see. That's in our favor." He looked up at Timothy, his grey eyes kind. "This is going to hurt, son. I won't lie to you about that. But the pain will tell me you're strong, that you're fighting. Can you fight for me?" "Yes, sir." Timothy's voice was barely a whisper. "Good boy." Jonas glanced at Frank. "Hold his shoulders. Don't let him move, but don't hurt him. Sarah, you take the other side. When I say, press here and here." He indicated spots on either side of the wound. "We need to close off these bleeders so I can see what I'm doing." Sarah moved into position, her heart pounding. She'd watched Jonas work on copper. But this was different. This was a child, bleeding and scared, with a father watching every move. The weight of it pressed down on her, but she pushed past the fear. Jonas needed her steady, so steady she would be. "Now," Jonas said, and Sarah pressed where he'd indicated. Blood welled up less freely. Jonas worked quickly, using silk thread to tie off the larger blood vessels with movements so practiced they seemed almost effortless. His focus was absolute. Nothing existed in that moment, except the wound and the work. Timothy cried out, tears streaming down his face, but he held still. Frank murmured reassurance, his own eyes wet. Sheriff Dalton kept the lamp positioned perfectly, his weathered face tense but steady. "Halfway there," Jonas announced. "You're doing fine, Timothy. Just a little longer." He began stitching the deeper layers first, closing muscle to muscle with careful precision. Sarah watched his hands move, large hands that looked like they should be clumsy, but were graceful, almost delicate in their accuracy. This was a man who'd done this hundreds of times, who'd learned his craft thoroughly and hadn't forgotten despite 5 years of disuse. The surface stitches came last, tiny and neat, pulling the skin together in a way that would minimize scarring. When Jonas finally tied off the last stitch and stepped back, he was breathing hard, as if he'd run up the mountain rather than spent 20 minutes working. That should do it. He wrapped the arm in clean bandaging, secure but not too tight. He'll need to keep it dry and clean, change the dressing every other day. Watch for redness, heat, swelling signs of infection. If you see any of that, you bring him straight back here. Frank was staring at Jonas like he'd witnessed a miracle. Doc Pierce would have taken the arm. He told me once that wounds that deep, on a child, he said the risk of infection was too high. Doc Pierce is a good physician, but he's been out here too long without access to newer techniques. Jonas was cleaning his instruments, his back to them now. "I learned from surgeons in Philadelphia who studied in Europe. Sometimes you can save what others would cut away, if you know how. How much do I owe you?" Frank's voice was rough with emotion. "Nothing. Sir, I can't, that is, I must." Jonas turned, and his expression was complicated satisfaction mixed with sorrow, purpose warring with old pain. "Your boy is alive and will heal. That's payment enough. Now take him home, keep him quiet for a week, and bring him back in 10 days so I can check the stitches." Frank stood, carefully lifting Timothy, who'd gone quiet now, exhausted from the ordeal. "Thank you," he managed. "I don't know what else to say, but thank you." After they'd left, Sheriff Dalton lingering to shake Jonas's hand and offer his respect, Sarah remained. She helped Jonas clean up, working in comfortable silence. When the cabin was restored to order, Jonas sank into a chair by the fire, looking more tired than she'd ever seen him. "You saved that boy's life," Sarah said quietly. "Maybe. Or maybe I just delayed the inevitable. Infection could still set in. Fever could take him." Jonas's voice was strained. "Stop." Sarah knelt beside his chair, forcing him to look at her. "You gave him a chance he wouldn't have had otherwise. You used your skill to help someone who desperately needed it. That's what physicians do. That's what you were meant to do." Jonas's eyes were haunted. What if he'd died on that table? What if my hands had slipped? What if I'd made the wrong choice? I couldn't have borne it, Sarah. Not again. But he didn't die. He's going home with his father, and in 10 days he'll come back with a healing arm. Sarah reached out, covered one of Jonas's large hands with her own small one. "You can't let fear of what might happen stop you from doing good when you can." Jonas looked at their hands, hers so small and pale against his scarred and weathered skin. When he spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "Elizabeth used to say something similar. That fear was just borrowed trouble, that all we can do is our best in each moment. She sounds like she was a wise woman." "She was." Jonas was quiet for a moment, then added, "You should probably get back to town before dark. People will talk if you stay up here too long." "Let them talk." Sarah stood but didn't move toward the door. Instead, she retrieved the handkerchief she'd brought, carefully wrapped. "I made this for you, to say thank you, for copper, for being the man you are, even when the world doesn't understand." Jonas unwrapped it slowly, and something shifted in his expression when he saw the embroidered flowers. His finger traced the delicate stitches, the careful detail. "These are from up here, near my cabin. I noticed them when I was here before. They seemed like they belonged to this place, like you do." When Jonas looked up at her, his eyes were bright with emotion he didn't try to hide. "Thank you. I can't remember the last time someone gave me a gift. Then it's past time someone did." Sarah moved to the door, then paused. "I meant what I said to Frank. You have a gift, Jonas Flint. It would be a shame to keep hiding it up here on this mountain." She left before he could respond, but as she rode down the trail in the fading light, she felt the weight of change settling over Cedar Bluff and everyone in it. Jonas had taken 2 more steps back toward the world today, first by helping Timothy, then by accepting a gift freely given. Small steps, perhaps, but in the right direction. And Sarah knew with quiet certainty that she'd be making the climb up that mountain again soon, and not just because Copper might need his bandage checked. Word spread through Cedar Bluff faster than wildfire through dry timber. By the next morning, everyone knew that Jonas Flint had saved Timothy Blake's arm, maybe his life. The mountain man was a trained surgeon, a real doctor, not just some hermit who got lucky. Frank Blake made sure of that, telling anyone who'd listen about the steady hands, the precise stitches, the knowledge that had preserved his son's arm when others would have amputated. Over the following 2 weeks, the transformation in Cedar Bluff's attitude was remarkable. People who'd crossed the street to avoid Jonas now nodded when they saw him. Mrs. Henley stopped spreading dark rumors and started speaking of him with something approaching respect. When Timothy's arm healed clean and true with minimal scarring, the last doubts faded away. Jonas made more trips to town, though he still kept largely to himself. But now, when he came down the mountain, people approached him with medical questions. A rancher's wife with a difficult pregnancy. A logger with a crushed hand that Doc Pierce wanted to amputate, but Jonas managed to save. A child with a fever that wouldn't break. Jonas helped them all, quietly, competently, asking for nothing in return. Sarah visited the mountain cabin 3 times in those 2 weeks, and each visit the conversation grew easier, deeper. Jonas told her more about his life before his training, his time in the army, the cases he'd handled. Sarah shared her dreams, her fears, the loneliness she carried. They found comfort in each other's company, a growing trust that surprised them both. On a crisp October afternoon, Sarah was hemming a wedding dress when Aunt Martha called up the stairs. "Sarah, there's a soldier at the door asking for Jonas Flint, says it's urgent." Sarah set aside her work and hurried down. A cavalry private stood in the doorway, dusty from hard riding, his horse lathered and breathing hard at the hitching post. He held an official-looking envelope, sealed with army insignia. "Ma'am, I'm looking for Jonas Elijah Flint, formerly a surgeon with the United States Army. I was told in town he might be found at this address, or someone here might know where to find him. He lives in the mountains above town." Sarah's heart had begun to pound, though she couldn't say why. "What's this about?" "Official Army correspondence, ma'am. Urgent matter. I was ordered to place it in his hands personally." Sarah made a decision. "I can take you to him. Give me a moment to get my coat." The ride up the mountain was tense. The soldier, whose name was Private Morrison, volunteered little beyond that he'd ridden 3 days straight from Fort Benson, changing horses twice. Whatever was in that envelope, it was important enough to warrant that kind of speed. Jonas was chopping wood when they arrived, his shirt sleeves rolled up despite the autumn chill. He saw them coming and set down the axe, wariness crossing his features at the sight of the uniform. Sarah dismounted quickly. "Jonas, this is Private Morrison. He has a letter for you, from the Army." Jonas's expression went carefully blank. "I mustered out 5 years ago. They have nothing to say to me." "Sir, I was ordered to deliver this personally." Morrison held out the envelope. "It's from Colonel Marcus Whitmore. He said to tell you it's about Fort Madison." At the mention of that name, that place, Jonas went very still. Sarah saw the color drain from his face. Slowly, as if the envelope might burn him, he took it. Morrison saluted, mounted his horse, and rode back down the trail without another word, his duty discharged. Jonas stood staring at the envelope, his hands trembling. Sarah moved to his side, laid a gentle hand on his arm. "What is it?" "Whitmore was my commanding officer at Fort Madison." "He was," Jonas's voice caught, "he was a good man. Fair. When Elizabeth and Emma died, he gave me leave to bury them, tried to convince me to stay. I walked away without explanation. What could he want after all this time?" Jonas broke the seal and unfolded the letter. As he read, Sarah watched his expression shift from confusion to shock to something that looked like devastation mixed with rage. His hands shook so badly the paper rattled. When he finished, he stood frozen, staring at nothing. "Jonas," Sarah touched his arm again. "What does it say?" He handed her the letter without a word. Sarah read it twice, her own shock growing with each sentence. "Colonel Whitmore was dying," the letter explained. "Consumption," the doctors said, and not long left. But before he died, he needed Jonas to know the truth about Fort Madison, about the cholera outbreak that had killed Elizabeth and Emma and 37 others. It hadn't been natural. Whitmore had investigated after Jonas left, following suspicions he'd had from the beginning. The disease had come in with contaminated supplies, food stores, and water barrels that should have been inspected but weren't. He'd traced the source to a contractor named Harrison Caldwell, a man who'd made a fortune supplying army posts across the frontier. Caldwell had cut corners, packed food in filthy conditions, stored water in contaminated barrels, all to increase his profit margins. When people started dying, he'd bribed inspectors and destroyed records. Whitmore had gathered evidence over the years, testimony from other posts where similar outbreaks had occurred, documents proving Caldwell's negligence. But Caldwell had powerful friends in Washington, and Whitmore's accusations had been buried. Now, dying, Whitmore was sending Jonas everything he'd collected. The evidence was irrefutable. Caldwell had murdered Elizabeth and Emma as surely as if he'd shot them, and he'd never faced justice for it. Whitmore was at Fort Benson now, in the hospital there, and he begged Jonas to come, to hear the full story, to take the evidence, to do what Whitmore no longer had the strength to do, ensure that Caldwell finally answered for his crimes. Sarah finished reading and looked up to find Jonas's face was a mask of anguish and fury. 5 years he'd blamed himself, carried the guilt of not being able to save his family. 5 years he'd believed his medical knowledge had failed, that he should have done something different, tried something else. And all along, they'd died because a wealthy man valued profit over human lives. Jonas, he killed them. Jonas's voice was flat, dead. Not cholera, not fate, not God's will. A man killed my wife and daughter for money, and he's never paid for it. The letter says Whitmore has evidence, proof. And what good does that do? The rage broke through now, hot and terrible. Elizabeth is still dead. Emma is still dead. Knowing why doesn't bring them back. No, Sarah agreed quietly. But it might save others. The letter says Caldwell still has army contracts, still supplies frontier posts. How many more will die if he's not stopped? Jonas turned away from her, his shoulders rigid. Sarah watched him struggle with emotions too large to contain grief renewed, rage at injustice, the terrible knowledge that his 5 years of self-imposed exile had been built on a lie. "Whitmore wants you to go to Fort Benson," she said. "Will you?" "I don't know," Jonas's voice cracked. "I don't know if I can face him. Face that place. Face any of it." Sarah moved in front of him, forcing him to look at her. "You're the bravest man I know, Jonas Flint. You saved my dog when you'd sworn never to practice medicine again. You saved Timothy Blake even though you were terrified. You've started helping people again despite the pain it brings up. This is just one more brave thing. This is different." "Yes, it is." This is harder, more personal, but that's exactly why you have to do it." Sarah's voice was firm. "Elizabeth deserves justice. Emma deserves justice. And every person who might die if Caldwell keeps operating deserves to be protected. You have the chance to do that, Jonas. Don't let fear stop you." Jonas closed his eyes, and when he opened them, tears tracked down his weathered cheeks. "I can't do this alone." "Then don't." Sarah took his hands in hers. "I'll go with you." "Sarah, no. It could be dangerous. Caldwell has power, money, connections. He won't just stand by and let himself be brought down." "All the more reason you shouldn't face him alone." Sarah's grip tightened. "You were there for me when I needed help. Let me be there for you now." Jonas looked at her, really looked at her, and Sarah saw the moment he accepted what had grown between them over these past weeks. Not just friendship, but something deeper, partnership, trust, the beginning of something that might, given time, become love. "All right," he said quietly. "All right, we'll go together." That evening, they began preparations. Jonas packed his medical bag, gathered the few things he'd need for travel. Sarah returned to Cedar Bluff to arrange things with Aunt Martha, to pack her own supplies. Frank Blake, hearing of the journey, insisted on lending his best horse. Sheriff Dalton came by with provisions and a warning about Caldwell's reputation. The man had gotten rich off the frontier, and rich men didn't give up power easily. The next morning, as dawn painted the mountains gold, Jonas and Sarah met at the edge of Cedar Bluff. Jonas wore his old army coat, faded but still serviceable, and he'd strapped a rifle to his saddle. Not because he wanted trouble, but because trouble might find them anyway. Around his neck, on a thin chain, hung Elizabeth's wedding ring, a small band of gold he'd kept close to his heart for 5 years. Sarah wore practical traveling clothes and carried a small pack. Copper, fully healed now, would stay with Aunt Martha. The little dog had given Sarah the courage to approach Jonas, had been the beginning of everything that followed. Now he'd be safe at home while they pursued justice for those who died. As they rode out of Cedar Bluff, heading north toward Fort Benson, the whole town came out to see them off, not to gawk or gossip, but to show support. Frank, Blake and Timothy, the boy's arm healing strong, Mrs. Henley with tears in her eyes, Doc Pierce with a respectful nod, Sheriff Dalton with his hand on his hat brim in salute. Jonas looked back once at the town that had feared him, then accepted him, then sent him off with their blessing. Something had shifted in the past weeks. He wasn't the isolated hermit anymore, wasn't the man who'd given up on the world. He was Jonas Flint, surgeon and healer, riding to seek justice with a woman he'd come to care for deeply at his side. The journey would be hard. The confrontation ahead would be harder. But for the first time in 5 years, Jonas wasn't running from his past. He was riding straight toward it, ready to face the truth and make things right. Elizabeth's ring rested against his chest, a reminder of what he'd lost and why he couldn't let Caldwell's crimes go unanswered. Emma's memory rode with him, innocent and trusting, deserving a world where men like Caldwell couldn't kill with impunity. The mountains fell away behind them as they rode north, and Jonas felt something he'd thought dead forever beginning to stir in his chest. Not quite hope, not yet, but purpose, clear and strong, pulling him forward into whatever came next. The journey to Fort Benson took 3 days, through country that grew progressively harsher. They followed the old military road north, through valleys that narrowed between granite peaks and across high passes, where snow already dusted the ground despite it being only October. The nights were cold enough to see their breath, and they huddled close to their campfires, sharing blankets and stories to pass the time. Jonas talked more on that ride than Sarah had ever heard him speak, about his training in Philadelphia, about the teachers who'd shaped his understanding of medicine, about the first time he'd saved a life, and how that had felt like touching something sacred, being allowed to participate in a mystery beyond human understanding. He talked about Elizabeth, about their courtship and marriage, about Emma's birth and the fierce love that had flooded him the first time he'd held his daughter. And he talked about the guilt, how he'd replayed those weeks of the cholera outbreak 1,000 times, wondering what he'd missed, what he could have done differently, how he'd examined his own skills and found them wanting, how that perceived failure had poisoned everything he'd been, everything he'd worked to become. "I was so certain it was my fault," he said on the second night, staring into the flames, "that if I'd just been smarter, faster, better, I could have saved them. Never occurred to me that I was fighting a battle already lost, that the enemy wasn't the disease but the greed that brought it." "You couldn't have known," Sarah said quietly. "No. But Whitmore did," he suspected. Jonas's jaw tightened. "He told me in the letter that he'd had doubts from the beginning, that the outbreak pattern was wrong somehow. But he didn't have proof until after I'd left, until he'd spent years investigating. Then he carries his own guilt. He couldn't save them either." Jonas was silent for a long moment. "I suppose that's true. We all carry what we couldn't prevent." Sarah shared her own stories during those 3 days. About her parents, who'd been loving but stern, who'd believed in hard work and honest living. About the fever that had taken them so quick there'd been no time for goodbyes, no time to prepare. About the loneliness that had followed, the years of just going through motions until Copper had given her something to care for beyond herself. "And then you came down from your mountain and helped him," she said. "Helped me. And suddenly I wasn't alone anymore, not in the same way." Jonas reached across the fire and took her hand. They sat like that for a while, connected by touch and understanding, until the fire burned low and they had to add more wood. They reached Fort Benson on the afternoon of the 3rd day. The fort was smaller than Sarah had imagined, a collection of wooden buildings surrounded by a palisade wall with mountains rising stark and beautiful behind it. It had the worn look of a place slowly being abandoned, soldiers reassigned to more critical posts, the frontier pushing ever westward and leaving places like this behind. The gate guard recognized Jonas's name immediately. "Mr. Flint? Colonel Whitmore's been asking after you every day. Said to bring you to him the moment you arrived." They were escorted through the fort to a small building that served as hospital and infirmary. Inside, the smell of sickness hung heavy in the air. An army doctor met them at the door, his face grave. "Surgeon Flint? I'm Dr. Brennan. The colonel's in the last room. I should warn you he's not well. Consumption has progressed significantly. But his mind is clear, and he's been holding on to see you." Jonas nodded, his face set. Sarah squeezed his hand once, then let go. "I'll wait here." "No." Jonas's voice was firm. "Come with me. I need you there." Dr. Brennan led them through the ward to a small private room at the end. Colonel Marcus Whitmore lay in a narrow bed, propped up on pillows, his breathing labored and wet. He'd been a large man once, Sarah could tell, but illness had wasted him. His uniform jacket hung on the bedpost, and she could see the eagles of his rank gleaming in the afternoon light through the small window. "Jonas." Whitmore's voice was thin but clear. His eyes, sunken in his gaunt face, brightened with recognition and relief. "You came. I wasn't sure you would." Jonas moved to the bedside, and Sarah saw his throat work as he swallowed emotion. "Sir, I came as soon as I got your letter." "Don't call me sir, not anymore. We're beyond that now." Whitmore's gaze shifted to Sarah. "And who's this?" "Sarah Clemens. A friend. More than a friend, I'd wager, from the way you look at each other." Whitmore managed a weak smile. "Good. You shouldn't be alone anymore, Jonas. Elizabeth wouldn't have wanted that." Jonas pulled a chair close to the bed, and Sarah stood behind him, her hand on his shoulder. Whitmore began to talk, his words coming slow but steady. He told them everything, how he'd suspected problems with Caldwell's supplies, even before the cholera hit Fort Madison, how he'd found similar outbreaks at 3 other posts supplied by the same contractor, how he'd spent 5 years gathering evidence while Caldwell's political connections blocked every attempt at official investigation. "I have it all," Whitmore said, gesturing weakly to a leather satchel on the table. "Bills of lading showing when contaminated supplies arrived, testimony from other post-surgeons about similar outbreaks, records I copied before they could be destroyed, even a deathbed statement from one of Caldwell's warehouse managers, a man whose conscience finally got the better of him." "Why didn't you go to the territorial governor?" "The federal marshal?" Jonas asked. "I tried. Caldwell has friends in the right places, or wrong places, depending on how you look at it. Army brass who benefit from his cheap supply prices, politicians who receive his campaign contributions, even a federal judge or two." Whitmore coughed, a wet, painful sound. "But there's one man he doesn't own, Governor James Morrison. He's new, only been in office 6 months, and he came from railroad work, made his own money, doesn't need Caldwell's. More importantly, he's honest. Rare thing in territorial politics. You want me to take this evidence to Helena?" "To the governor, yes. But more than that." Whitmore reached out with a trembling hand, and Jonas took it. "I want you to face Caldwell first. Look him in the eye and tell him you know what he did, that Elizabeth and Emma's deaths are on his hands. He needs to know he can't hide behind his money and connections anymore." "That's dangerous," Sarah said. "If Caldwell realizes Jonas has evidence, he'll be in Helena with it before Caldwell can act." Whitmore's grip on Jonas's hand tightened. "I need you to do this, Jonas. I need someone who understands what was lost, who can speak for those who died. The army won't listen to a dying colonel, but they'll listen to a grieving husband and father who has proof." Jonas was quiet for a long time. Sarah felt the tension in his shoulders, the war being fought inside him. This wasn't just about justice anymore. This was about confronting the man who'd destroyed his life, about putting a face to the enemy he'd been fighting in his mind for 5 years. "I'll do it," Jonas said finally. "But Sarah was right, it is dangerous. If something happens to the evidence, I've made copies. Dr. Brennan has one set, sealed and ready to be sent to Washington if anything happens to you. But nothing will happen. Caldwell's dangerous when hidden, but once the light shines on his crimes, he's just another coward." Whitmore released Jonas's hand and settled back against his pillows, exhausted. "There's a telegraph office here. Send word to Governor Morrison that you're coming. The official request will make it harder for Caldwell to act against you." They talked for another hour, Whitmore providing details about Caldwell's operation, his known associates, the best approach to take with the governor. When the old colonel finally drifted into sleep, Jonas and Sarah stepped out into the late afternoon sun. "He's dying," Jonas said quietly. "Maybe days, maybe just hours. But he held on until you came, until he could pass this burden to someone who'd carry it forward." Sarah took Jonas's arm. "That took strength." They spent that night at Fort Benson, in quarters assigned to them by Dr. Brennan. Jonas stayed up late, going through the evidence Whitmore had collected, reading testimony that broke his heart and hardened his resolve in equal measure. Sarah sat with him, a quiet presence, offering comfort when the weight became too heavy. In the early hours before dawn, Jonas woke from troubled sleep to find Sarah sitting by the window, looking out at the mountains silhouetted against the pre-dawn sky. "Can't sleep?" he asked. "Thinking about tomorrow. About what comes next." She turned to face him. "Are you ready for this? To face Caldwell?" Jonas rose and moved to stand beside her. "I don't know if I'm ready, but I know I have to do it. For Elizabeth and Emma, for all the others who died because one man valued profit over lives. What will you say to him?" "The truth. That's all I have, the truth and evidence he can't deny, and then I'll watch him answer for what he's done." They stood together in silence as dawn broke over the mountains. Later that morning, Colonel Marcus Whitmore passed away peacefully in his sleep, his final duty discharged. Jonas and Sarah attended his burial that afternoon, a simple military ceremony with full honors. As the soldiers fired their salute and the bugler played taps, Jonas touched the ring hanging beneath his shirt and whispered a promise to the friend he'd just lost. Justice would be done. They left Fort Benson the next morning, riding toward Helena with evidence that could bring down one of the territory's wealthiest men. The journey would take 4 more days, and every mile brought them closer to a confrontation that had been 5 years in the making. Jonas was no longer the broken man who'd fled to the mountains. He'd found purpose again, found healing in helping others, found connection in Sarah's steady presence. But the final test still lay ahead, facing the man who'd killed his family and ensuring that no one else would die for Harrison Caldwell's greed. As they rode, Sarah noticed Jonas sitting straighter in his saddle, his eyes fixed forward with determination. The mountains fell away behind them, and ahead lay the territorial capital, where justice waited to be served. The feared mountain man of Cedar Bluff was gone. In his place rode Jonas Elijah Flint, army surgeon and father, husband and healer, riding toward reckoning with evidence in his saddlebags and righteousness in his heart. And beside him rode Sarah Clemens, seamstress and friend and something more, ready to stand with him no matter what came next. Together they would see this through to the end, whatever that end might be. Jonas turned to leave, Sarah at his side. As they reached the door, Caldwell called out, his voice tight with barely controlled anger. "You have no idea what you're starting. No idea who you're up against." Jonas paused, looked back. "I'm a man who lost everything because of your greed. What more can you take from me?" Then he walked out, closing the door firmly behind him. They descended to the street in silence, Sarah's heart pounding. She'd watched Jonas confront the man who'd killed his family with dignity and controlled fury, had seen Caldwell's mask crack to reveal the calculating coward underneath. But she'd also seen the threat in Caldwell's eyes, the promise of retaliation. "That was dangerous," she said once they were clear of the building. "It was necessary." Jonas's jaw was set. "Now we go to the governor before Caldwell can move against us." They walked quickly to the territorial government building, an impressive structure of stone and brick that housed the governor's offices. Jonas sent in his card with a clerk, requesting an immediate audience and mentioning Colonel Whitmore's name. The weight of a dying man's last request carried them through bureaucratic resistance, and within 20 minutes they were shown into Governor James Morrison's office. Morrison was younger than Sarah expected, perhaps in his early 40s, with a direct gaze and no-nonsense manner. He gestured them to chairs across from his large desk. "Mr. Flint, Miss Clemens, my clerk says this concerns Colonel Whitmore and is urgent. I received a telegraph from Fort Benson 3 days ago indicating the colonel had passed away. You have my condolences." "Thank you, sir." Jonas set the leather satchel on the governor's desk. "Before he died, the colonel gave me this. 5 years of evidence proving that Harrison Caldwell's supply company has been responsible for multiple disease outbreaks at army posts across the territory. Contaminated goods, bribed inspectors, covered-up negligence. 39 people died at Fort Madison in 1872. My wife and daughter were among them." Morrison's expression grew grave. He opened the satchel and began reviewing documents, his experienced eye quickly grasping the scope and quality of the evidence. He was quiet for long minutes, reading through testimony, examining bills of lading, cross-referencing reports. Finally, he looked up. "This is substantial, well documented. Whitmore did thorough work." He paused. "But Caldwell has considerable influence. Bringing charges against him will be difficult." "Difficult isn't impossible." Jonas leaned forward. "Governor, how many more people have to die before someone with the authority to act actually does? Whitmore tried for years and was blocked. You're new enough to be clear of Caldwell's corruption. You have the power to demand a federal investigation." Morrison stood, moved to his window overlooking Helena's streets. "You're right. I am new, and that gives me certain advantages." He turned back to them. "It also means I need to be careful. If I move against Caldwell without ironclad evidence, His friends in Washington will bury me. But if I have everything documented properly— "What do you need from us?" Sarah asked. "Your testimony first. Mr. Flint, you were the post surgeon at Fort Madison. You witnessed the outbreak, tried to treat the victims. Your professional opinion carries weight." Morrison returned to his desk. "I'll also need time to review this evidence thoroughly and consult with the territorial marshal. Say 3 days. Caldwell knows we're here." Jonas's voice was tight. "I confronted him this morning, told him I had Whitmore's evidence." Morrison's eyebrows rose. That was bold, also foolish. It was necessary. He needed to know he couldn't hide anymore. "Well, what's done is done." The governor's expression hardened with resolve. "I'll have the marshal put surveillance on Caldwell, make sure he doesn't flee or destroy evidence. In the meantime, I suggest you stay somewhere secure. The boarding house on Aspen Street is run by a widow named Mrs. Patterson. She's discreet and trustworthy. Tell her I sent you." They spent the next 3 days in a state of tense waiting. Mrs. Patterson provided them with clean rooms and good food, asking no questions beyond what was necessary for hospitality. Jonas paced, restless and anxious. Sarah tried to keep him occupied with conversation, with walks through parts of Helena that Caldwell's people were unlikely to frequent. On the morning of the 4th day, a clerk from the governor's office arrived with a summons. Morrison wanted to see them immediately. They found the governor's office crowded. Morrison sat behind his desk, flanked by the territorial marshal, a hard-eyed man named Coleman, and a federal judge. On the side wall, a court stenographer waited with her equipment ready. "Mr. Flint, Miss Clemens, thank you for coming." Morrison's tone was formal now, official. "I've reviewed Colonel Whitmore's evidence thoroughly and consulted with federal authorities. Based on what I've found, Judge Harrison has agreed to issue a warrant for Harrison Caldwell's arrest on charges of criminal negligence resulting in death, fraud in government contracting, and bribery of federal officials." Jonas's hands gripped the arms of his chair. Sarah saw tears spring to his eyes. "Marshal Coleman will execute the warrant within the hour," Morrison continued. "Your testimony will be formally recorded today and used in the trial. Justice may be slow, Mr. Flint, but it's finally coming." They watched through the governor's window an hour later as Marshal Coleman and his deputies led Harrison Caldwell out of his office in handcuffs. The great businessman looked smaller now, diminished, his confident mask completely shattered. People stopped on the street to stare, whispers spreading like wildfire. Caldwell looked up at the government building, seemed to sense Jonas watching, and their eyes met across the distance. There was no triumph in Jonas's expression, no satisfaction, just a quiet acknowledgement that justice, however delayed, was being served. Sarah took Jonas's hand. "It's done. Elizabeth and Emma can rest now." Jonas nodded, unable to speak around the emotion in his throat. The ring beneath his shirt seemed warmer somehow, as if Elizabeth was there with him, approving of what he'd done. Governor Morrison appeared at Jonas's elbow. "The trial will take months, maybe longer. Caldwell will fight with every resource he has. But the evidence is solid. He'll answer for what he did. Thank you, Governor. For believing me. For acting when others wouldn't. Thank Whitmore. His work made this possible." Morrison paused. "What will you do now?" Jonas looked at Sarah, then back at the governor. "Go home. Back to Cedar Bluff. There are people there who need a doctor, and I've been away from healing long enough." They left Helena the next morning, lighter somehow despite the long journey ahead. The confrontation with Caldwell was over. Justice was in motion, and Jonas Elijah Flint was finally free of the guilt that had driven him into the mountains 5 years ago. The ride back to Cedar Bluff took a week, and they were in no hurry. The urgency that had driven them north was gone now, replaced by a quieter sense of completion. They took their time, camping under stars that seemed brighter than before, talking late into the nights about everything and nothing. The weight Jonas had carried for 5 years was lifting, and Sarah could see it in the way he sat his horse, the way he smiled more freely, the way he looked at her with hope instead of just sorrow. Spring came early, the year after Caldwell's trial and conviction. Jonas had testified by deposition, sparing him the need to return to Helena, and the jury had taken less than a day to find Caldwell guilty on all charges. The businessman was sentenced to 20 years in territorial prison, his company dissolved, his fortune seized to compensate the families of those who died. It wasn't enough. Nothing could bring back Elizabeth and Emma, but it was justice, and that mattered. Jonas had moved his practice down from the mountain cabin to Cedar Bluff proper. The town had come together to build him a small office on Main Street, just down from Doc Pierce's place. The two physicians worked well together, Pierce handling routine ailments, while Jonas took on the more complex cases that required surgical skill. A sign hung above the door, simple but proud. J. Flint, physician. Sarah still did her sewing, but now she spent half her time at Jonas's office, having discovered she had a gift for nursing. Jonas taught her to dress wounds, to prepare medicines, to assist with procedures. They made a good team, anticipating each other's needs, working with the comfortable rhythm of long partnership. On a warm afternoon in late May, Sarah was organizing supplies in the office when Jonas appeared in the doorway, looking uncharacteristically nervous. He held something behind his back. "Sarah, could you come outside for a moment?" She followed him out to the small garden behind the office, where mountain flowers bloomed in careful beds Jonas had planted over the winter. He'd spent hours on this garden, and Sarah had understood it was his way of honoring what he'd lost, creating beauty, nurturing life. Jonas turned to face her, and Sarah saw he was holding the small carved horse that had sat on his cabin mantel for 5 years. He looked at it for a long moment, then knelt and set it carefully at the base of a young pine he'd planted in the corner of the garden. "Elizabeth gave this to Emma on her 3rd birthday," he said quietly. "It was her favorite toy. She carried it everywhere." He stood, brushing dirt from his hands. "I've been holding on to it like if I just kept it close enough, kept the memory alive enough, I could somehow go back and change what happened." Sarah moved to his side, said nothing, just waited for him to continue. "But I can't go back. No one can. And I think," his voice caught, "I think Elizabeth would tell me it's time to let go. Not to forget, but to stop living in what's gone and start living in what's here." He turned to Sarah, took both her hands in his. "You brought me back to life, Sarah Clemens. You and that little dog, and your courage in climbing a mountain to ask a feared man for help. You showed me that healing wasn't just about medicine, it's about connection, about being willing to be vulnerable, about choosing to care even when caring hurts." Sarah's eyes filled with tears. "Jonas, I loved Elizabeth with everything I was. I loved Emma more than my own life. That won't change, and I don't want it to." He squeezed her hands gently. "But I've learned that the heart doesn't run out of room for love. It just grows bigger. And I've come to love you, Sarah, in a different way but no less real. If you'll have me, I'd like to build a future together. Not forgetting the past, but not being bound by it either." Sarah couldn't speak for the emotion flooding through her. She'd loved Jonas for months now, had known it even before their journey north, but she'd never dared to hope he might feel the same. She'd thought she'd always be second to ghosts, and she'd been willing to accept that. But here he was, offering her not his whole heart, because part of it would always belong to Elizabeth and Emma, but a whole relationship, a partnership built on shared loss and hard-won healing. "Yes," she managed. "Yes, Jonas Flint, I'll marry you." He pulled her close, held her like she was precious and fragile and strong all at once. They stood like that for a long time in the garden, among the flowers and the growing things, while the afternoon sun warmed them, and Copper, who'd followed them outside, barked happily at nothing in particular. They married in August, a simple ceremony at Cedar Bluff's small church. The whole town attended Frank Blake and Timothy, whose arm had healed strong and true, Mrs. Henley, who cried through the entire service, Sheriff Dalton, standing proud in his best clothes, Doc Pierce, who'd become Jonas's good friend and mentor in the ways of community medicine. Even the ranchers from the high country came down, men who'd heard of Jonas's skill and respected his quiet strength. Sarah wore a dress she'd sewn herself, simple but beautiful, with wildflowers embroidered along the hem, the same flowers from Jonas's garden. Jonas wore his army coat, the eagles on his collar polished bright, Elizabeth's ring on a chain around his neck, and a new band waiting to go on Sarah's finger. That evening, after the celebration and the well-wishes, Jonas and Sarah walked up to his old cabin one last time. They'd decided to keep it as a retreat, a place to go when they needed quiet and space to breathe. But their home would be in Cedar Bluff now, in a small house behind the medical office, right in the heart of the community they served. Jonas stood in the clearing where he'd spent 5 years hiding from the world, and he felt no regret at leaving. This place had served its purpose. It had held him while he healed, given him space to carry his grief. But he was ready now to live again, fully and completely. Sarah took his hand. Ready? More than ready. He looked at his wife that still amazed him, and smiled. Let's go home. They rode down the mountain together as the sun set behind the peaks, painting the sky in shades of gold and rose. Copper trotted alongside their horses, completely healed, absolutely joyful. In the distance, they could see the lights of Cedar Bluff beginning to glow in the gathering dusk. Jonas thought about the journey that had brought him here, from the broken man hiding in the mountains to the healer serving his community, from isolation to love, from guilt to peace. It had started with a young woman brave enough to ask for help, and a little dog that wouldn't stop crying. It had led through confrontation and justice, through pain acknowledged and wounds finally beginning to heal. And it had ended here, riding toward home with the woman he loved, toward a future built on honesty and connection, and the daily choice to keep living, keep loving, keep finding meaning in the work of healing. The toy horse remained in the garden, a memorial and a marker. The past was honored but no longer binding. Elizabeth and Emma would always be part of Jonas's story, woven into who he was. But they were no longer the only story, no longer the end of everything. Sarah was right, hearts didn't run out of room. They just expanded to hold more love, more loss, more life. And Jonas Flint, once the feared mountain man of Cedar Bluff, now its trusted physician and Sarah's devoted husband, had learned that the greatest courage wasn't in facing down enemies or seeking justice. It was in being willing to heal, to open yourself to hurt again, to choose connection over safety and love over isolation. That was the lesson Copper's crying had taught him, the gift Sarah's trust had given him. As they reached the edge of town, Jonas looked up at the mountains one last time. They'd always be there, solid and enduring, a reminder of where he'd been. But his eyes didn't linger. Instead, he looked forward, toward the lights of home and the life waiting to be lived. "Thank you," he whispered, not sure if he was speaking to Elizabeth, to Whitmore, to Sarah, or to something larger than all of them. "Thank you for giving me another chance." The mountains stood silent in their wisdom, keeping their secrets, holding their peace. And Jonas Flint rode on toward tomorrow, his heart finally whole enough to face whatever came next.